Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
All right, in the studio with Terry Fallis. His latest novel is The Marionette. First of all, welcome. Thanks for coming in and sitting down and talking about the book.
Nice to be here, Michael. Thanks for having me.
So, do you see this as like an offshoot of the Angus universe?
That's a good question. It may well be, I guess, because technically Angus has a role to play in this novel, although we don't talk about that on the back cover of the book. It's kind of I think I may have intended it as sort of an Easter egg for the readers to discover, but I've been talking about it at Book Talk. So that's it was fun to have him back, if only making a few cameo appearances, you might say. But he's responsible in his new ministerial portfolio for CSIS, so it made sense to bring him back, and it was nice to get together with him after a couple of books since I've seen him.
Was it like when you were creating this story and this central character, or well, characters, because I think Coop is kind of a shared character, were you imagining it within that existing world that you'd created in like the Angus sphere?
I was, because I wanted it to be, I like to write Canadian novels, and sure, there's a temptation to make it a CIA agent instead of a CSIS, or CIA story instead of a CSIS story, but I'm not that interested in doing that. So it was Canadian, and because at the end of the last Angus novel, Operation Angus, which was my 8th novel, this is number 10, he was promoted to Minister of Public Safety responsible for CSIS. That's one of his areas of responsibility. So, when I started to think about writing a comic thriller, which was how this began, I thought, well, it could be CSIS, and then Angus could pop in and out. Not an Angus novel. It's a James Norval novel, I figure. Mm-hmm. But he's in that world.
What's your relationship to thrillers? Like, are you a reader of thrillers?
That is a really good question. I like thrillers. I used to read them a lot. I read them less often now, but I still read. When Daniel Silva writes a new novel, I read it. I think he's pretty good. But I wouldn't call myself a thriller, even a thriller aficionado, let alone a thriller expert from reading all sorts of thrillers. I read a bunch of Robert Ludlum's and Frederick Forsyth when I was in my teens, I guess.
Right.
And I'm a huge Sherlock Holmes fan, so Conan Doyle is kind of one of my literary heroes. So I have a good relationship with it, but I like to set a writerly challenge for myself when I write a new novel. I don't want to repeat myself too often, and I think I have on a number of occasions. So the writerly challenge I set for myself this time was to write a comic thriller in a foreign land.
So that was like, these are the things I want to hit.
Right.
It's the comic aspect, the thriller aspect, and set elsewhere outside of Canada.
Right, just to push myself a little bit.
As I understand it, like research and preparation are like the major part of your book writing. Like, I think I read an interview, you said like 12 to 14 months of like kind of planning, and then the writing is actually kind of like the shortest burst of things?
That's correct, although I wouldn't really call it a research phase. It is planning. It's more planning than research, because okay. I often write about worlds that I know about, notwithstanding this novel. Mm-hmm. I'm not a closeted CSIS operative. But so it's I don't always love doing research on things I have no idea what they're about and then try and persuade you that I know a lot about that. So I tend to stay within the worlds that I care about, that I'm interested in, that I've researched recreationally for many years. So that time is not spent researching. That time is spent mapping out the story, character arcs, and developing, for me, a detailed outline. And what that 12 to 14 months planning stage yields is an 85 or 95 page scene-by-scene bullet point version of the novel.
So this is almost like for film having storyboards, like they've basically plotted out kind of the
Correct.
beats and things, and you've done that.
I've done that, and it's and that guides then the writing of the manuscript in the last couple of months.
Right.
So I put that on one side of my screen, the outline, and a fresh document on the left side of my screen, and I follow my very detailed outline. And what that allows me to do is to commit all of my questionable cerebral powers at that stage to the act of crafting sentences. No part of my brain is worried about what my characters are going to do on the next paragraph or page. I know what they're going to do. I know what they're going to do from start to finish. And I've known that for months by that stage. So I'm really just focused on the writing. And I always want the writing to be as good as I can make it. That doesn't necessarily mean it's really awesome writing. It means as good as I can make it. But I commit all of my focus to writing at that stage.
I was very curious about your relationship to like research and preparation based on James, because he's a stickler for detail.
Yeah.
And obviously, like we meet him in Tajikistan, and he's researching things and kind of getting into hot water as a result of it.
Right.
But that attention to detail comes up as like kind of one of his character traits.
Correct.
Throughout this. And then, in reading, kind of like pulling back and like, holding the page a little further back, realizing like, Fantasau, which is a restaurant that you refer to, exists in the real world.
You checked it, didn't you?
I did.
And that's exactly why I made sure it was a real restaurant, because not just literary journalists such as you, but readers will check those things. So, I've never been to Mali. We're not supposed to go to Mali. I've never been to Tajikistan. Canadians are not supposed to go to Tajikistan. We don't even have diplomatic relations with them, which is why
the diplomat ends up coming from out of country.
From Kazakhstan, which I only knew because I researched that to make sure. So I put in those little details to try to persuade the reader that I have spent time in Tajikistan and in Mali, because you looked up the Fantasau restaurant, and I remember that name because it's such an unusual name. But yeah, there's a real restaurant. So not only would I look it up, but I would then look at Google Earth or Google Maps or whatever and find out what's going on around there. And so that's all part of persuading the reader that the research has been more than what it was.
But is it also then plotting out, because that in that circumstance, they walk through the restaurant and cut out the back and get into another car, looking on Google Earth to see
yes,
the mechanics of this.
Correct.
Is this plausible action?
Yes, that's exactly right. And even their route, as I'm describing it, I'm following their route on a map. And how they get there, and then they hit a town, which I forget the name of, and then they turn left, and then they find that little road. There is a little road that goes right to the river. That's not made up. Mm-hmm. I made sure there was. There may have been a more convenient spot to cross, but there wasn't a road there, so we went a little further.
Is that the way that you are as a writer because of who you are as a reader? Like, is that something that you key into, those kind of details, and like the hope that the person who wrote the book spent time on this kind of craft?
Yes, I think so. I'm not sure I've given that a great deal of thought, but now that you've mentioned it, that's probably it. It may also be because I'm an engineer by academic training, so it's almost hard-boiled into or hardwired into an engineer to plan. Like engineers design things and build things with a plan. So I've never been a professional engineer, I hasten to add. I went a different direction after I earned the degree, but I still think like an engineer, and I did so before I went to engineering school. So I think part of it is as a reader and wanting to know that I'm in good hands, in the author's hands, but also I'm a planner, so I'm used to making sure that it's all going to work, and that if someone checked, they would find that it was true. Because I want the novels. They are fiction. They are by definition untrue stories, but I want them to be plausible, and this story in particular, not to short circuit where you're heading with this discussion, but not only could all of these things happen, since I've written the novel, much of the novel has actually happened.
Right, the gold mine, which I do want to get to.
Okay.
But before we get there, just staying on the track of like who you are as a writer and talking about the central character and how I stress that maybe it's characters, is usually there's some sort of avatar for an author within the book. And on the face of it, James should be you, right? And as a writer, maybe he is, but as a character, I think Coop is more you.
Yeah.
Right? In terms of like enacting a plan and thinking things through, whereas when he's thrust into the action, he's fly by the seat of his pants guy.
He doesn't really know what he's doing. He thinks he knows what he's doing. Yes, that approach to problem solving, I may be more like Coop, but the part of me that is James is the voice. And I tend to write in the first person, which means you get a lot of James's voice. And writers strive to write authentically, I guess, and to connect with the reader. And I find it's easier to do that if I'm writing in a voice with which I am wholly familiar, which is my voice. I'm not the character. It's not autobiographical. I wouldn't behave in the same way that James behaves, but I know that voice very well.
Mm-hmm. Was it intentional to make him like a fish out of water? That like
yes.
That's the comic part of the comic thriller, is this guy who spends all his time dreaming up these scenarios is thrust into the one?
Correct. Yeah, a fish out of water is actually the phrase that I use, and it's a great gift for comic writers, the fish out of water scenario, and almost all of my comic novels, which are most of them, there is a fish out of water aspect to it that is often a principal driver of the humor, of a stranger in a strange land. Angus McLintock on the floor of the House of Commons when he's a mechanical engineering professor from Scotland.
Right.
All he has is his honesty and his ethics, but that makes for comic situations as he navigates a world that he never expected to find himself in. And in this case, you've got James Norval, who may think that he knows a lot about intelligence operations and clandestine missions because he writes very successful thrillers. That's just not how they work in the real world.
Right. And you have a foil in an actual CSIS agent in Coop that, circling back to your own point in terms of being like ripped from headlines, one of the things you ripped from the headlines was a judgment around CSIS and their ability to, work, let's say, extracurricularly
yes.
in the global arena.
Yes.
And that kind of prompted some of this.
It did. Because I want the novel to be plausible, and it would not be plausible if CSIS were not permitted to operate clandestinely in other countries or, when necessary, break the laws of those countries in service of the protection of Canada. And that all changed in, I think it was 2022. I stumbled upon this article, and a federal judge granted CSIS the ability to operate clandestinely in other countries. The same sort of permission or authorization that CIA, MI6, the Mossad have had since their inception, but we never have. It doesn't mean CSIS wasn't doing anything. We're doing a lot, but a lot of it was done from our shores. We were not venturing elsewhere, or we were not doing things that would violate that they weren't allowed to do until now.
So when you see something like that, like, are your antenna up for like this as a storytelling device, or like how do you filter information like that?
Yeah, that's a good point, because having said I want it to be plausible, I think I assumed they could already do that. And so when I started researching CSIS and, does CSIS have outposts in other countries? And you Google things like that and you ask questions. And that was when I discovered that only recently were they granted that authority to do that. But it is part of the story. And you see that sort of works its way into the story I just mean as an aside. But I want people who didn't read the article I read and think that CSIS can't do that anymore, I want them to realize, oh no, they can, and here's my citation, even though it's in a novel.
And even within the text, they're wrestling with what that means exactly. Like
yes, yeah, exactly. And I don't think anyone really knows. And because CSIS operates secretly, clandestinely, perhaps they may be playing fast and loose in the field with that judgment. But at least there is something that says that they have been granted this by their own country, admittedly. I mean, Mali didn't grant them the right to do it, but the Canadian government has. So
you mentioned Mali. That brings us to the mine.
Ah, okay.
And the fact that, so this takes place in Mali after, an overthrow of a government.
Yet another coup.
And then the Canadians get involved because there's a resource extraction company from Canada operating in that country, and several Canadians are stuck. This ends up being something that actually happens.
Yeah, after I wrote the novel. It wasn't before. I wasn't basing it on that story. It hadn't happened when I wrote it. That's the strange part.
So then what led you to, like a gold mining company? Was it just looking at like what resources and what Canadian businesses are operating in countries?
Yes. Well, number one, I was looking for a lawless country to set my story in, an unstable government. And so I would research things. I would review. There's something called the Fragile States Index, which ranks all the countries in the world under the general term fragile states. But what they mean is, how democratic is it? Are they observing human rights? Is there a widespread corruption? All those things that define a country that is as far away from how Canada operates day to day as you can imagine. And Mali is, of all the countries in the world, Mali, I think, is number 11 or 14. It was, in the top 15 most fragile states. Fragile seems like a euphemism. It means like it's not a place you want to spend any time. And so I was looking at resource companies, because I know that Canada operates in other countries, gold mines. Not Canada, but Canadian companies operate in faraway lands, and in mineral extraction was one of them. And I'd read a couple of stories about Mali, and I learned very quickly that there's two Canadian gold mines. One of them is the one by Barrick Resources. I think it's called the Barrick Mine. And so I thought, what is the first thing that plausibly a new government, a newly installed regime might do? Well, they might not want to pay the Canadian company their fair share for leading this mining extraction exercise, and they might just nationalize the mining industry and keep all the profits for themselves, and meaning that they would need to make sure the Canadians running the mine stayed there to run it, because they don't know how to run, the new government doesn't know how to run the mine. So it struck me as a very as a plausible scenario, and that's what I wrote. And I didn't know at the time that I was writing it that there was some tension between Barrick and the junta in Mali. I'm not even sure there was that tension when I was writing it. Mm-hmm. But a year after I finished the manuscript, when we were literally just this past summer, as you probably saw, Mali has seized the mine from Barrick. They actually flew a military chopper in and commandeered 35,000 ounces, or $117 million worth of gold, and just removed it from the mine, and for their own projects, or maybe just to line their pockets. One isn't sure. And I swear I didn't know. I knew nothing about that when I was writing it. It was a bit alarming to notice the parallels. I hoped I wasn't actually not just predicting the future. I hoped I wasn't shaping the future when I wrote it. But CSIS hasn't called, so I had no insider information. I just made a lucky guess when I was plotting out this story.
It was Norval-esque in terms of just like plugging away at your own thing and
Yeah.
discovering that you're part of a larger plot or something.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's quite interesting. So I talk about I have those, clippings in my book talk, and it's always a bit eerie to have written this novel and then to read these stories that are, it's not exactly the same story, but it's remarkably similar.
You mentioned before about writing in the first person, that choosing to do that just in terms of voice. When you weave in other characters the way you do, like, are you ever tempted to like shift voices and like shift your focus?
Maybe tempted, but I can tell you that when in my first novel, you have to make that decision, what is the point of view in this novel? How are you going to write it? I worried that if I wrote it with an omniscient narrator, that all the characters would end up sounding the same, and I wouldn't know which character to favor and which character to spend more time with, that kind of thing. And it simplified the story for me if I just wrote it through one person's set of eyes. Of course, that has some challenges in it, because if your narrator's not in the room, you have to find creative ways of sharing other elements in the story, or not sharing them at all and sticking to this one person. But I needed to ground myself in one person's voice to make sure the story held together for me, I guess. So it gave me a sense of comfort that I always knew through whose eyes this story was being told. And it meant that for all of the narrative exposition beyond dialogue, it was one voice. It was the voice of the narrator. And that sort of helped me with consistency and stability as I wrote my way through the story. And I clung to that perhaps as a life raft in all my novels, except for the new one I've just finished that I'm editing now. That is my first time I've tried.
Shifted away from that.
I've shifted, yes. That's another story.
So in writing with James's perspective then, everyone else, our perspective of them is through James's eyes and
Yes.
how, as he tells it. When you're in that, engineering phase, are you thinking about the characters as James sees them, or are you thinking about the characters as themselves and then applying a layer of like James's perspective?
And that's a great question. And the honest answer is I do both, because I want to make sure I know who the other characters really are. And then I spend time thinking about, okay, how does James, who has some blind spots and is not always a reliable narrator, how is he going to perceive that person, and what is he going to miss? What is he not going to see in that character? And how is that all going to play out and shape their relationship, and more importantly, the growth and development of their relationship as the novel ensues? So I think about both, and because he's his own person, he has some blind spots. He thinks pretty highly of his understanding of clandestine operations, because he's written so many successful thrillers, and his measure, he thinks he knows it because the books have sold so well, which, if you think it through, is not really adequate evidence that he understands how clandestine operations actually work.
Right, that these are really popular depictions of things that no one knows anything about.
Yes, and the reader likes it because they know there's going to be a movie, and they're going to get to see all this stuff, these gadgets, these explosions, these car chases and submarines, theatrics, and, CGI and all this stuff. And so, that's not a good measure of how well he understands how clandestine operations actually work. And as we talked about already, that disparity in his understanding, or lack of understanding, and Coop's knowledge of clandestine operations is kind of what drives not just their relationship, but it's often a vehicle for humor.
Mm-hmm. And yet you do write a theatric, escape in the end.
Well, that was because Coop is not flawless either. not to give too much away, but I think Coop is sort of too much by the book and was ready to shut down the operation. And bless him, James Norval thinks a little more outside the box, usually way too far outside the box, but he's not governed by the same strictures that the CSIS field manual imposes on their operations. And it's almost natural for him to think a bit more creatively. And that's what happens. So in the end, you have growth in the characters. You have James recognizing now that he doesn't know nearly as much as he thought he knew. But you also have Coop, who I think realizes there is some merit sometimes in tossing the CSIS field manual aside and thinking a little bit more creatively and getting the job done within the bounds of reason. So they both move a little, and that brings them closer together. They're both quite self-aware, I think, eventually.
I was going to say, yeah, maybe not
Eventually.
at the beginning.
No, not at the beginning.
I think, James doesn't understand why he's not considered charming right off the hop.
Yeah, it's fun to. I mean, many of my characters are like that. They're, some combination of helpless, hapless, and hopeless. Not in any really debilitating way. And James has a good heart. He's smart, and he wants to do the right thing. So I want him to be a good person and a good character, but he doesn't always know what he doesn't know.
Is that what sets things up well for the humor? That like the hapless, helpless, hopeless thing makes them less competent to go through the mechanics of the whatever the plot?
Yes, and I think it humanizes him as a character as well. Like, he's not James Bond. He's a bit of a goof in a harmless way in some instances. But his heart is in the right place, and I hope the reader sees that he's got some flaws, but they're more annoying and irritating than they are fundamental.
You leave the door open for him to come back, but it sounds like this next book is not a James Norval novel if it's written from a different perspective.
The next one is not a James Norval novel, but it was clearly intentional on my part to leave the door open, not because I have decided to write 4 more James Norval novels. I have not. I just like to hedge my bets, and if this novel is warmly embraced by readers, and it seems like a good idea to try another one, that's well within the realms of possibility that I will do that and bring them back. That was kind of fun. So I know I have, I have an option there.
Right, and like I said, in terms of the starting things off, the Angus verse, you can populate more people within this pool of
That's
characters.
True.
It seems
That's true.
Yeah.
Which, it may sound like I've given that element of it an awful lot of thought. I really haven't, but I do like the idea, simply because that first novel, the fact that it miraculously won Canada Reads means that more Canadians know about Angus than know about any of my other novels, or will ever know more about any of my other characters and other novels. That's just the Canada Reads effect. So if I'm going to create some kind of a universe, it makes sense to have at its core the character that more people know. And I think there's a genuine affection for him as a character, unless I'm only getting people writing me who like him, and the people who don't like him aren't writing me. But
well, folks can learn about James Norval and the Marionette. Terry, thanks very much for coming in and sitting down and talking about the book.
Michael, thanks for having me, and really thoughtful questions. Thank you.